On a balmy Tuesday morning in late September, the sun cast a warm glow over the sprawling medical complex just outside Houston, Texas. The air buzzed with the usual hum of activity, ambulances arriving, nurses hurrying between wings, and the constant beep of medical equipment. Amidst this controlled chaos, a young couple stepped through the sliding glass doors of the main entrance, wholly unaware that their lives were about to be turned upside down. Sarah Johnston, 24 years old, but blessed, or perhaps cursed, with a face that belied her years, clutched her husband Mark's hand as they approached the reception desk. Her heart fluttered with the normal nervousness that accompanied any doctor's visit, but there was an undercurrent of excitement too. This was supposed to be a routine checkup, a formality really, before they began trying for their first child. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice soft but clear. "I have an appointment with Dr. Ramirez at 9:30. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly as she took in Sarah's appearance. "Of course, dear. And are you here with your father?" Mark, who at 32 sported a neatly trimmed beard that added gravitas to his features, felt a familiar twinge of irritation. He'd lost count of the number of times he'd been mistaken for Sarah's relative or guardian. "I'm her husband," he corrected gently, squeezing Sarah's hand. The receptionist's cheeks flushed pink. "Oh, I'm so sorry. My mistake." She busied herself with the computer, the click of her nails against the keyboard filling the awkward silence. "All right, Sarah. If you could just fill out these forms and have a seat, someone will be with you shortly." As they settled into the hard plastic chairs of the waiting room, Sarah leaned her head against Mark's shoulder. "You'd think I'd be used to it by now," she murmured. Mark pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Hey, look on the bright side. When we're both old and gray, you'll still be turning heads." Sarah's laughter, light and melodious, drew the attention of a nearby nurse. The woman's brow furrowed as she watched the couple, a seed of concern taking root in her mind. 30 minutes later, Sarah's name was called. As she stood, smoothing down her flowery sundress, she caught the nurse's questioning gaze. A chill ran down her spine, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. The examination room was cool and sterile, the walls a soothing shade of mint green. Dr. Ramirez, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, greeted them warmly. "Sarah, Mark, it's good to see you both. How have you been feeling, Sarah?" As Sarah began to recount her recent health history, Dr. Ramirez's expression grew increasingly troubled. She asked probing questions about Sarah's menstrual cycle, her diet, her energy levels. With each answer, the furrow between the doctor's brows deepened. "Sarah," Dr. Ramirez said finally, her tone carefully neutral, "would you mind if I brought in a colleague for a second opinion? I just want to ensure we're covering all our bases." Sarah and Mark exchanged a worried glance. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As Dr. Ramirez stepped out, the silence in the room grew thick with tension. Mark took Sarah's hand, rubbing soothing circles with his thumb. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, trying to convince himself as much as her. Minutes stretched like hours before Dr. Ramirez returned, accompanied by a tall man in a white coat. "This is Dr. Patel, our endocrinology specialist," she introduced. "Dr. Patel, this is Sarah Johnston and her husband, Mark." Dr. Patel's eyes widened as he took in Sarah's appearance. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Johnston, would you mind telling me your age?" Sarah blinked, confused. "I'm 24. Is something wrong?" The two doctors exchanged a loaded glance. Dr. Ramirez stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you a very serious question, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you here of your own free will?" The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah felt as though she'd stepped into a surreal dream. "What? Of course I am. What's going on?" Dr. Patel spoke next, his words careful and measured. "Mrs. Johnston, based on your physical development and the information you've provided about your health, we have serious concerns. If you're in a situation where you feel unable to speak freely, Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Wait a minute. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Sarah is my wife. She's 24 years old. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Dr. Ramirez held up a placating hand. Mr. Johnston, please calm down. We're simply trying to ensure your wife's well-being. But the wheel had already been set in motion. As raised voices echoed through the thin walls of the examination room, a nurse hurried to make a phone call. Within minutes, the hospital security team had been alerted, and a call was placed to the local authorities. In the span of a single hour, what should have been a routine checkup had spiraled into a nightmare of misunderstanding and suspicion. As Sarah and Mark tried desperately to explain, to make sense of the chaos unfolding around them, neither realized that their ordeal was only just beginning. The stage was set for a drama that would challenge their love, their patience, and their faith in humanity. But from the ashes of this misunderstanding would rise a phoenix of awareness, compassion, and change that would touch lives far beyond the walls of this Houston hospital. As the autumn sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, casting long shadows through the hospital windows, the situation inside was rapidly spinning out of control. The examination room, once a haven of privacy and medical confidentiality, had become ground zero for a whirlwind of activity and rising tensions. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Patel stood their ground, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and professional determination. Sarah, her eyes wide with disbelief, sat perched on the edge of the examination table, her knuckles white as she gripped the paper covering. Mark paced the small room like a caged lion, his earlier calm evaporating in the face of what he perceived as an outrageous accusation. "This is insane," Mark said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. "We came here for a routine checkup, and now you're treating us like criminals? Sarah is my wife. We've been married for 3 years." Dr. Ramirez held up a placating hand. "Mr. Johnston, please understand. We have a duty of care to all our patients, especially those who may be vulnerable. Your wife's physical appearance is due to a medical condition," Sarah interjected, finding her voice at last. The tremble in her words betrayed her rising panic. "I have a rare genetic disorder. It's called Rothman-Thompson syndrome. It affects my growth and development. I've dealt with this my entire life." A flicker of doubt crossed Dr. Patel's face, but it was quickly replaced by professional skepticism. "Mrs. Johnston, if that's the case, we'll need to see medical records confirming your diagnosis. Until then, we have to proceed with caution." As if on cue, a sharp knock at the door heralded the arrival of hospital security. 2 burly men in uniforms stepped into the already crowded room, their presence adding a new layer of tension to the charged atmosphere. "Doctors," one of the security guards said, his voice low and authoritative, "we've been informed of a potential situation. The police are on their way. What would you like us to do in the meantime?" Dr. Ramirez straightened her shoulders, years of medical training kicking in as she took control of the situation. "Mr. Johnston, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside with these gentlemen while we continue our examination of Sarah." Mark's face flushed with anger. "Absolutely not. I'm not leaving my wife alone when you're treating her like this." Sarah reached out, grabbing Mark's hand. "It's okay," she said softly, though her voice quavered. "Go with them. The sooner we cooperate, the sooner this will all get sorted out." For a moment it seemed Mark might argue further. But seeing the plea in Sarah's eyes, he relented. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But I want it on record that I'm cooperating under protest. This is a gross violation of our rights." As Mark was led from the room, Sarah felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. She'd faced misunderstandings about her condition before, but never anything like this. The gravity of the situation began to sink in, and she felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Sarah," Dr. Ramirez said gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to understand that we're acting in your best interests. Can you tell me more about this condition you mentioned?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah launched into an explanation she'd given countless times before. She described the rarity of Rothman-Thompson syndrome, the way it affected her physical development, the challenges she'd faced growing up looking far younger than her peers. With each word, she prayed for understanding, for someone to recognize the truth in her story. Meanwhile, in a small conference room down the hall, Mark sat across from the two security guards, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. He'd been asked to empty his pockets, and his cell phone, wallet, and keys sat in a neat pile on the table between them. "Sir," one of the guards began, his tone professional but firm, "can you tell us how long you've known Sarah?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "We met 6 years ago in college. We dated for 3 years before getting married. I have photos, documents, our entire history together. Why won't anyone listen?" Before the guard could respond, the door opened, admitting two police officers. The female officer, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, took the lead. "Mr. Johnston, I'm Officer Chen. This is my partner, Officer Davis. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the young woman you brought in today." As Mark began to recount his story yet again, his mind raced. How had a simple doctor's appointment turned into this nightmare? Would anyone believe them? And most pressingly, what was happening to Sarah? Back in the examination room, Sarah had moved from the table to a chair, hugging her knees to her chest as Dr. Patel gently pressed for more information. "Sarah, can you tell me about your parents? Do you have any contact with them?" The question, innocent as it seemed, opened a floodgate of emotion. Sarah's lower lip trembled as she replied, "My parents died in a car accident when I was 19. That's part of why this is so hard. They were always my advocates, the ones who helped me navigate the world when people didn't understand my condition." For the first time since the ordeal began, a flicker of genuine sympathy crossed Dr. Patel's face. He shared a look with Dr. Ramirez, a silent communication passing between them. Perhaps there was more to this story than they'd initially assumed. As the afternoon wore on, the hospital buzzed with activity. Nurses whispered in corners, speculation running rampant. Social services had been contacted, and a caseworker was en route. The police continued their questioning, building a profile of Sarah and Mark's life together. Through it all, Sarah and Mark remained separated, each feeling increasingly isolated and misunderstood. The weight of judgment pressed down on them, threatening to crush their spirits. But beneath the fear and frustration, a spark of determination burned. They knew the truth, and somehow they would make others see it too. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, no one involved in the unfolding drama could have predicted how this day would end, or how it would change their lives forever. The stage was set for a confrontation between truth and assumption, between the power of love and the weight of societal expectations. In the hours to come, hearts would be tested, beliefs challenged, and the very notion of appearance versus reality would be turned on its head. For Sarah and Mark Johnston, the fight to reclaim their life and dignity was just beginning. And for the medical staff, law enforcement, and soon, the public at large, a lesson in compassion, understanding, and the dangers of rushing to judgment was about to be learned, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of this Houston hospital. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital corridors, the atmosphere inside had reached a fever pitch of tension and confusion. In one room, Sarah sat alone, her petite frame seeming to shrink under the weight of scrutiny and disbelief. Across the hall, Mark continued his frustrated explanations to increasingly skeptical police officers. Sarah's mind raced, replaying memories of similar, albeit less intense, misunderstandings throughout her life. There was the time in high school when a new teacher had tried to send her to the middle school building on the first day of class, or the countless occasions when waiters had offered her the children's menu well into her 20s. But never, in her wildest dreams, had she imagined a situation like this. A soft knock at the door jolted Sarah from her reverie. A woman entered, her demeanor calm and professional. "Hello, Sarah. I'm Lisa Watkins from Social Services. I'd like to talk with you for a bit, if that's all right." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. As Lisa settled into a chair across from her, Sarah couldn't help but notice the gentleness in the woman's eyes. It was a stark contrast to the clinical suspicion she'd faced for the past few hours. "Sarah, Lisa began, her voice soft but clear. I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever your situation, we're here to help. Can you tell me, in your own words, what brought you to the hospital today? Taking a deep breath, Sarah launched into her explanation once more. She spoke of her excitement to start a family with Mark, of the routine nature of the appointment, of the shocking turn of events that had led to this moment. As she talked, she noticed Lisa watching her intently, not just listening to her words, but observing her mannerisms, her confidence, the way she held herself. And this condition you mentioned, Lisa probed gently, Rothman-Thompson syndrome. Can you tell me more about how it affects you? Sarah's eyes lit up with a mixture of frustration and determination. It's rare, which is part of the problem. Most people, even doctors, have never heard of it. It affects my growth, my skin, my bone density. But the most noticeable thing, the thing that's caused all this trouble, is how it affects my appearance. I've looked like a teenager since I was a teenager. As Sarah continued to explain the intricacies of her condition, Lisa found herself increasingly convinced by the young woman's knowledge and the genuine emotion in her voice. This wasn't the hesitant, scripted response of someone under duress. This was the impassioned explanation of someone who had lived with this reality her entire life. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Mark's patience was wearing dangerously thin. For the last time, he said, his voice hoarse from repetition, I am not some predator. Sarah is my wife. She's 24 years old. We have a life together, a home, jobs, friends. How many times do I have to say it before someone believes me? Officer Chen, who had been silently observing for the past half hour, finally spoke up. Mr. Johnston, I understand your frustration, but you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. Your wife appears to be significantly underage. We have a duty to investigate. Mark ran his hands over his face, exhaustion etched in every line. I get it, I do, but there has to be a way to verify what we're telling you. Our marriage license, Sarah's birth certificate, her medical records, they'll all confirm everything we've said. A knock at the door interrupted the tense exchange. Officer Davis stepped out to confer with a colleague, returning moments later with a thoughtful expression. Mr. Johnston, we've just received some information that might help clarify things. Would you be willing to answer a few more specific questions about your wife's medical history? For the first time in hours, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Yes, of course. Anything that will help sort this out. L of continuity of the last paragraph. Certainly. I'll continue the narrative from where we left off. As the questioning resumed, this time with a focus on the details of Sarah's condition, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism slowly giving way to confusion, and then, gradually, to a dawning realization. Mark, sensing the change, pressed his advantage. He described Sarah's struggles with her condition throughout her life, recounting specific medical procedures she'd undergone, specialists they'd consulted, and the daily challenges they faced together. With each detail, each personal anecdote, the truth of his story became increasingly difficult to deny. Officer Chen leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. Mr. Johnston, I have to admit, the level of detail you're providing, it's not something someone could easily fabricate. But you understand we'll need to verify everything you've told us. Mark nodded, relief washing over him. Of course, please, verify everything. Call our doctors, our families, our employers. The truth is on our side. As this scene unfolded, Sarah found herself in a similar position with Lisa from social services. The more Sarah spoke about her life, her hopes, her fears, the more Lisa's professional detachment gave way to genuine empathy. Sarah, Lisa said softly, after a particularly poignant description of Sarah's struggle to be taken seriously in her career. I want you to know that I believe you. Your story, your emotions, they're real. I'm so sorry for what you've been through today. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, the weight of the day's stress finally cracking her composure. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much that means to hear. Lisa reached out, gently squeezing Sarah's hand. We're going to sort this out. I promise. But I need to ask, do you feel safe with Mark? Is there anything about your relationship that concerns you? Sarah's response was immediate and emphatic. Mark is the best thing that's ever happened to me. He stood by me through everything, the stares, the whispers, the misunderstandings. He's my rock. What's happening today? It's our worst nightmare come true, but we'll get through it together. We always do. The conviction in Sarah's voice, the love shining in her eyes as she spoke about Mark, erased any lingering doubts in Lisa's mind. This was not a victim speaking about her abuser. This was a woman deeply in love with her husband, frustrated by a world that couldn't see past appearances. As the afternoon stretched into evening, a flurry of activity overtook the hospital. Phone calls were made, records were requested, and slowly but surely the truth began to emerge. Sarah's medical history, her birth certificate, their marriage license. Piece by piece, the evidence mounted, confirming everything the couple had been saying. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Patel huddled in a corner, poring over Sarah's hastily obtained medical records. Their expressions shifted from confusion to shock to finally deep embarrassment. "My God," Dr. Ramirez murmured. "They were telling the truth all along. How could we have gotten this so wrong?" Dr. Patel shook his head, his face ashen. "We were so caught up in what we thought we saw, we couldn't hear what they were actually saying. This is a massive failure on our part." As the truth solidified, a new flurry of activity began. How could they make this right? How could they even begin to apologize for the trauma they'd inflicted on this couple? In separate rooms, Sarah and Mark each felt the shift in energy. The suspicion that had hung heavy in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a nervous, almost contrite atmosphere among the hospital staff and authorities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to Sarah's room opened. Mark stood there, flanked by Officer Chen and Dr. Ramirez. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, casting protocol aside, Mark rushed forward, enveloping Sarah in a fierce embrace. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "They know. They finally believe us." As the couple clung to each other, the others in the room shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their misjudgment hanging heavy in the air. The day's events had exposed not just a rare medical condition, but the dangers of assumption, the importance of listening, and the strength of love in the face of adversity. Little did Sarah and Mark know, but their ordeal was far from over. As news of the incident began to spread, they would soon find themselves at the center of a media storm, their private struggle thrust into the public eye. But for now, in this moment of reunion, none of that mattered. They had weathered the storm together, their bond stronger than ever. Dr. Ramirez cleared her throat, drawing the couple's attention. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnston," she began, her voice heavy with regret, "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for what you've been through today. What happened here was unacceptable, and we—" But her words were cut short as alarms began blaring throughout the hospital. In the chaos of the day's events, another crisis had been unfolding, one that would soon intertwine with Sarah and Mark's story in ways no one could have predicted. As staff rushed to respond to the emergency, Sarah and Mark exchanged a look. Their ordeal might be over, but something told them their journey was just beginning. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the room, ready to face whatever came next, together. The shrill sound of alarms echoed through the hospital corridors, adding a new layer of chaos to an already tumultuous day. Sarah and Mark, still reeling from their emotional reunion, found themselves swept up in a tide of rushing medical personnel and panicked voices. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the din. She clung to Mark's hand, drawing strength from his presence. Dr. Ramirez, her earlier apology forgotten in the face of this new crisis, was already moving toward the source of the commotion. "Stay here," she called over her shoulder. "We'll sort this out as soon as we can." But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As nurses and doctors rushed past, a gurney came barreling down the hallway. On it lay a young woman, her face contorted in pain, her swollen belly a clear indication of late-stage pregnancy. The scene was chaos, monitors beeping erratically, medical staff shouting orders, the woman's agonized cries cutting through it all. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward. "I can help," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'm a certified midwife." The medical team, caught off guard by this unexpected offer, hesitated for just a moment. But the woman on the gurney let out another cry of pain, and suddenly, credentials and hospital protocols seemed far less important than the immediate need for skilled hands. Dr. Ramirez, returning to the scene, made a split-second decision. "Fine," she said, locking eyes with Sarah, "but I'll be overseeing everything. Let's move." As they rushed towards the delivery room, Mark found himself once again relegated to the sidelines. But this time, instead of frustration, he felt a surge of pride. This was Sarah in her element, the Sarah the world so often failed to see, competent, confident, and capable. Inside the delivery room, the atmosphere was electric. The laboring woman, who managed to gasp out that her name was Elena, was in distress. The baby was in a breech position, and Elena's blood pressure was dangerously high. Sarah, her earlier ordeal momentarily forgotten, snapped into professional mode. She spoke soothingly to Elena, her gentle touch and calm demeanor a stark contrast to the frantic energy around them. "Elena, I'm Sarah. I know you're scared, but I need you to focus on my voice. We're going to get through this together, okay?" As Sarah worked, her expertise became increasingly evident. She guided Elena through her breathing, her hands sure and steady as she assisted with the delivery. Dr. Ramirez, initially hovering with a mixture of professional concern and lingering guilt, found herself stepping back, allowing Sarah to take the lead. Minutes stretched into hours, the delivery room a crucible of pain, fear, and ultimately hope. And then, finally, a new sound pierced the air, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. "It's a girl," Sarah announced, her voice thick with emotion. "She's beautiful, Elena. You did it." As the medical team tended to mother and baby, ensuring both were stable, a palpable shift occurred in the room. The doctors and nurses who had just hours ago viewed Sarah with suspicion now looked at her with undisguised admiration. Dr. Ramirez approached Sarah, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That was remarkable," she said softly. "I've never seen anyone handle a breech birth so skillfully. You quite possibly saved 2 lives today." Sarah, cradling the newborn as she prepared to hand her to Elena, smiled tiredly. "It's what I'm trained to do. It's who I am, even if people can't always see it." The weight of those words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the day's earlier events. As news of the dramatic delivery spread through the hospital, it collided with the still unfolding story of Sarah and Mark's ordeal. Journalists, already alerted to the potential scandal of a suspected child bride, now found themselves with an even more compelling narrative: the misjudged midwife who saved the day. In the hours that followed, as Elena and her baby rested comfortably under the watchful eye of the medical staff, Sarah and Mark found themselves at the center of a media whirlwind. Reporters clamored for interviews. Social media exploded with hashtags, and the hospital administration scrambled to get ahead of what was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. Through it all, Sarah and Mark clung to each other, islands of calm in a sea of chaos. They answered questions patiently, sharing their story with a mixture of honesty and grace that touched hearts and opened minds. "We just want people to understand," Sarah explained to one particularly sympathetic reporter, "that appearances can be deceiving. My condition doesn't define me, but it has shaped my experiences. If our story can help even one person think twice before judging someone based on how they look, then maybe all of this will have been worth it." As the sun began to set on what had undoubtedly been one of the most extraordinary days of their lives, Sarah and Mark finally found a moment of quiet together. Sitting in a small hospital garden, away from the prying eyes and probing questions, they allowed themselves to process the whirlwind of events. "I still can't believe it all happened," Mark said, his arm wrapped protectively around Sarah's shoulders. "This morning we came in for a simple checkup, and now—" Sarah leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Now the whole world knows our business," she finished with a wry smile. "But you know what? I'm almost glad it happened this way." Mark raised an eyebrow, prompting her to continue. "For years I felt like I had to constantly explain myself. justify my existence in adult spaces. It's been exhausting. But today I got to show the world who I really am. Not just Sarah the woman who looks like a teenager, but Sarah the midwife, Sarah the professional, Sarah the wife. Mark pressed a kiss to her temple. You were amazing in there. I've always known how incredible you are, but watching you take charge saved that baby. I've never been more proud to be your husband. As they sat together, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky, both Sarah and Mark knew that their lives had changed irrevocably. The challenges they'd faced, the misunderstandings they'd endured, all of it had led to this moment. But neither of them could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences of this day would be. As their story spread, it would touch lives across the country and beyond, sparking conversations about prejudice, about the dangers of snap judgments, about the myriad ways in which people can defy expectations. For Sarah and Mark, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one in which they would become reluctant advocates, voices for those who had long gone unheard or unseen. It was a role they never sought, but one they would embrace with the same strength and grace that had carried them through this extraordinary day. As they finally left the hospital, hand in hand, they stepped out into a world that had shifted on its axis. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Their love, a beacon of hope, in a world too often blinded by appearances. Little did they know, their journey was far from over. The events of this day had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge them in ways they could never have imagined, test the strength of their bond, and ultimately lead them to a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. But for now, as they drove home through the quiet streets of Houston, Sarah and Mark allowed themselves to simply be two people in love, grateful for each other, and cautiously optimistic about the future that lay ahead. The days following Sarah and Mark's harrowing hospital experience unfolded like a surreal dream. Their story, a potent cocktail of medical intrigue, societal prejudice, and ultimate triumph, had captured the public imagination in ways they could never have anticipated. As dawn broke on the first morning after their ordeal, Sarah and Mark awoke to find their modest suburban home besieged by news vans and reporters. The flickering of camera flashes illuminated their bedroom, a stark reminder that their private struggle had become a very public spectacle. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, peering through a gap in the curtains at the media circus assembling on their front lawn. Mark wrapped his arms around her, his chest pressed against her back, his chin resting on her shoulder. "We face it together," he said softly, "just like we always have." And face it, they did. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Mark found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their story dissected and debated on national news programs, talk shows, and across social media platforms. They told their tale countless times, of their meet-cute in a college library, where Mark had initially mistaken Sarah for a lost high school student, of their gradual falling in love, marked by quiet moments of understanding and loud declarations of devotion in the face of raised eyebrows and whispered judgments, of the challenges they'd faced in their careers, in their social lives, in their quest to start a family. With each retelling, Sarah and Mark found their narrative evolving. What had once been a source of private pain became a powerful tool for education and awareness. They spoke candidly about Rothman-Thompson syndrome, demystifying the rare condition for millions of viewers. They addressed the prejudices they'd faced, not with bitterness, but with a gentle insistence on understanding and compassion. "It's not about us anymore," Sarah explained during a particularly poignant interview. "It's about all the people out there who've ever felt judged, misunderstood, or invisible because they don't fit some arbitrary norm. If our story can help change even one person's perspective, then every difficult moment will have been worth it." As their platform grew, so did the scope of their advocacy. Sarah, emboldened by the positive response to her impromptu midwifery at the hospital, began speaking out about the importance of trusting women's expertise and experiences in healthcare settings. Mark, drawing on his background in education, addressed the dangers of making assumptions about students based on appearance. Their inbox overflowed with messages from around the world. Heartfelt thank yous from people with rare conditions who finally felt seen. Apologies from individuals who recognized their own biases. Questions from medical professionals eager to learn more. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny. Not everyone was supportive of their message. Online trolls attacked Sarah's appearance, accusing her of fraud or worse. Conservative pundits questioned the appropriateness of their relationship, despite the clear evidence of Sarah's age. Each barb stung. Each accusation reopened wounds they thought had long since healed. Maybe we should step back, Mark suggested one evening, after a particularly vicious online attack had left Sarah in tears. We don't owe the world our story. We don't have to keep putting ourselves out there like this. Sarah wiped her eyes, her resolve hardening. No, she said firmly. That's exactly what they want. For us to be silent, to disappear. We can't let them win. Not when we're making a difference. It was this resilience, this unwavering commitment to their cause, that ultimately turned the tide of public opinion. As weeks turned to months, Sarah and Mark's story transcended mere sensationalism, evolving into a touchstone for discussions about empathy, inclusivity, and the dangers of judging books by their covers. Their advocacy work led them to unexpected places. They were invited to speak at medical conferences, sharing their experiences with healthcare professionals eager to learn how to better serve patients with rare conditions. They visited schools, encouraging students to look beyond appearances and to stand up against bullying in all its forms. Perhaps most surprisingly, they found themselves consulting on a television show, a medical drama that wanted to incorporate a storyline about a character with Rothman-Thompson syndrome. Sarah and Mark worked closely with the writers and actors, ensuring that the portrayal was not only accurate but nuanced and respectful. As their first anniversary since the hospital incident approached, Sarah and Mark found themselves reflecting on the whirlwind their lives had become.